Between 1910 and 1920, the black population of one Georgia county fell from 1,098 people to 30. Not 30%, 30 people. Say the numbers slowly because the drop is the whole story. 1,098 down to 30 in the space of a single decade. That's not migration. Migration doesn't move like that. That's an emptying, deliberate, violent, and fast. And it happened in Forsyth County, Georgia, in the hills north of Atlanta, in a farming community called Oscarville, and it happened in a matter of weeks in the autumn of 1912. Now hold those numbers next to some others. Lake Lanier today, over 38,000 acres of water, nearly 700 miles of shoreline, more than 10 million visitors a year, one of the most visited Army Corps lakes in the entire United States, over 200 feet deep at its deepest. And by most estimates, somewhere between 500 and 700 people have died in its waters since it filled in the 1950s, a death toll so high and so strange that a genuine national reputation has grown up around the idea that the lake is haunted, or cursed, or hungry. Beautiful. One of the most beloved recreation spots in the American South, ringed with marinas and lake houses and 4th of July fireworks. And yet, underneath the pontoon boats and the wakeboarders, on the bottom, in the dark, are the streets and foundations and wells of the communities that were there first, including Oscarville, including a place whose black residents were terrorized off their own land 40 years before the water ever arrived. So here's the question I want to carry the whole way through. And I need you to hear it precisely, because this story gets told wrong in both directions. There's a popular version that says the government built this lake to drown a black town, a deliberate act of racial erasure by water. And there's a dismissive version that says it's just a lake, and the deaths are just statistics, and the past is the past. Both of those are wrong. The truth sits in the terrible space between them, and it asks a harder question than either. What does it mean to build a paradise on stolen ground? Not stolen by the people who built the lake, but stolen 20 years earlier by a mob, and then, quietly, legally, inherited. Who owns the guilt when the crime and the concrete are separated by 4 decades? And what do we owe the people at the bottom, whether the water put them there on purpose or not? If you're drawn to the towns America put underwater, this is the darkest one I'll ever tell you. So, I'm going to be careful with it. Let me tell you what actually happened. Let me deal with the myth first directly, because if I don't, it'll sit under everything else and rot. The story that goes viral, on TikTok, in podcasts, in 1,000 breathless posts, is that Lake Lanier was created specifically to drown Oscarville, that the Army Corps of Engineers flooded a living black town as an act of racial violence, and that the bodies of murdered black residents are still down there, and that's why the lake kills people. That is not what happened, and I want to be honest with you about that, because the truth is actually worse in a way, not better. Here's the timeline that breaks the myth. The racial cleansing of Forsyth County happened in 1912. Buford Dam wasn't authorized until 1946. Construction didn't start until 1950. The lake didn't begin filling until 1956. By the time the water came, Oscarville's black community had been gone for 44 years. The people who were driven out in 1912 were not drowned in 1956. They were long gone, scattered across Georgia and beyond, most of them dead of old age by the time the first drop of the Chattahoochee backed up behind that dam. And by the 1950s, when the government bought and flooded that land, the people living there were white. The land that had belonged to black families in 1911 had been seized, resold, and farmed by white residents for 2 generations. So, the flooding was not an attack on a black town. It couldn't have been. The black town was already 40 years dead. I know that's less satisfying than the viral version, but sit with why it's actually more damning. Because the real story isn't the government drowned a black town. The real story is a black community was violently stolen in 1912. The theft was never undone. The stolen land was quietly absorbed into white ownership and then into a federal reservoir. And today, one of the most popular lakes in America sits on top of it, while almost nobody who visits knows any of that happened. The water didn't commit the crime. The water just makes it easy to forget there was one. That's the thing about erasure. It doesn't require malice at the final step. It just requires that nobody at the final step has to look. So let me take you back, not to 1956, to before all of it, because Oscarville wasn't a footnote. It was a genuine place. Forsyth County, after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, was one of the places where something remarkable and fragile was happening. Black Americans, many of them formerly enslaved, were building, buying land, starting farms and businesses and churches. By the early 1900s, more than 1,100 black people lived and worked in Forsyth County, and they weren't all sharecroppers scraping by. There were landowners, skilled tradesmen, carpenters, blacksmiths, bricklayers. 50-plus black families owned their own land outright, which in the Jim Crow South was both an achievement and, it would turn out, a target. Oscarville was one of these communities, sitting along the Chattahoochee River. Farms and homes and churches. Ordinary life. The kind of ordinary that was, for black families in Georgia in 1910, quietly extraordinary because every acre of it had been earned against a system built to prevent exactly that. I want you to picture it the way you'd picture any of these lost places. River bottom farmland in the North Georgia foothills, cotton and corn, mule teams, church on Sunday in a building the congregation raised themselves, children walking dirt roads, the particular green heaviness of Georgia in late summer, the air thick enough to lean on, cicadas going in the trees. A community that had made something out of almost nothing in one of the hardest places in America to be black and free. And it was all functioning. And then in September of 1912, it ended in about 3 weeks. Here's what happened, and I'm going to tell it plainly, because it deserves to be told plainly. On September 9, 1912, an 18-year-old white woman named May Crow was found in the woods near Oscarville, badly beaten and assaulted. She would die of her injuries days later. What followed was not justice. It was a lynching and a purge. 4 young black people were accused, teenagers and young adults who happened to live nearby. Ernest Knox, 16, Oscar Daniel, 18, Oscar's sister, in her early 20s, and Robert Edwards, called Big Rob, 24. The evidence against them was thin to non-existent by any standard we'd recognize. This was the Jim Crow South, where a black suspect and a dead white woman was all the proof a mob required. The day after Rob Edwards was arrested, a white mob, some accounts put it at 2,000 people, stormed the jail in Cumming, the county seat. They dragged Edwards out of his cell. They shot him. They dragged his body through the streets and hanged it from a pole outside the courthouse, in public, as a message. 2 of the others, Ernest Knox and Oscar Daniel, were tried, if you can call it that, and sentenced to hang. Their execution was a public event. Thousands of people came to watch 2 teenagers die. Some accounts say 8,000 spectators, but the killings weren't the end. They were the trigger. After May Crow's death and Edwards's lynching, organized bands of armed white men, they called themselves Night Riders, went through Forsyth County, house by house, church by church, with torches and guns. They burned black homes. They burned black churches. They fired into houses. They gave black families ultimatums measured in hours: get out or die. And people got out. Of course they got out. What would you do with your children in the house and armed men on the road? They left everything: farms they owned, crops in the field, furniture, tools, livestock, homes, tombstones even, the graves of their own dead. They fled with what they could carry, and behind them, white locals seized the land, the property, the wealth, all of it. 1,098 down to 30. That's the arithmetic of those weeks. And here's the part that turns it from a historical horror into a living one. Forsyth County stayed white, deliberately, for decades. It maintained an unofficial and viciously enforced whites-only reputation well into the 1980s, so thoroughly that as late as 1987, a civil rights march through Forsyth County had to be protected from mobs by the National Guard. 75 years after the purge, and it still wasn't safe to be black there in daylight. That's the ground Lake Lanier would eventually be poured over. Not empty ground, emptied ground. This part never sat right with me, and I've thought about it a lot, so let me just say it. The land those black families were driven off of in 1912, the farms, the acres they'd earned, that land didn't disappear. It got inherited. White families took it, worked it, passed it down, sold it. And when the federal government came in the 1950s to buy up land for the reservoir, they bought it from those owners. They paid to whoever held the title in 1952 for land that had been stolen from someone else in 1912. So somewhere in the paper trail of Lake Lanier, there are federal dollars that were paid to people for land they only held because a mob had cleared the rightful owners off it 40 years earlier. The government didn't steal that land. It just purchased the results of a theft at market rate from the beneficiaries and asked no questions about how the title got so clean. Nobody involved in building the dam had to think about any of that. The Army Corps engineer surveying the valley in 1951 wasn't a racist mob leader. He was a guy with a transit and a slide rule doing a job. That's exactly the point. Erasure at scale doesn't need everyone to be guilty. It just needs the guilt to have happened far enough back that the people at the end can honestly say, "That wasn't me," and they'd be right. And the land would still be stolen. I don't have a clean resolution for that. I don't think there is one. But I don't think you get to build Georgia's favorite lake on top of it and never say the words out loud. So, why was the lake built at all? Atlanta, that's the short answer. Atlanta was exploding. In the first half of the 20th century, Atlanta grew from a regional city into the capital of the New South. And a growing city needs three things from a river. It needs water to drink, it needs power, and it needs the river to stop flooding the places people want to build. The Chattahoochee River could provide all three if you put a wall across it. In 1946, Congress passed the River and Harbor Act, and it authorized a dam on the Chattahoochee at a place called Beaufort. The purposes were the usual trinity of these projects: flood control, water supply for Metro Atlanta, and hydroelectric power. Recreation, the thing the lake is now overwhelmingly famous for, wasn't even the original point. That came later, almost as a side effect. Construction on Beaufort Dam began March 1st, 1950. It took about 6 years and something like $45 million. And notably, a large share of that budget, more than 40%, went not to concrete but to buying up land and relocating the people on it. That tells you how many people were there. This wasn't empty wilderness. It was farms and homesteads and small communities across 5 counties: Hall, Forsyth, Dawson, Gwinnett, Lumpkin, and all of them had to go. And a lot of those people did not go willingly. This is documented. Many residents in the reservoir area fought the government's purchase of their homes in court, filing civil lawsuits to stop it. They lost. They almost always lose. Eminent domain for a federal water project is very close to unstoppable, and the people of the Chattahoochee Valley found that out the same way the people of Monticello and St. Thomas and Kennett did. You can fight it, you just can't win. The dam was completed and the sluice gates were closed on February 1st, 1956, and the Chattahoochee began to back up. Now, here's a detail that I think about every time I hear this lake described as haunted, because it's the actual root of the haunting, and it's grimmer than any ghost story. They didn't fully clear the bottom. When the Army Corps prepared the reservoir, they relocated a lot. They moved buildings, they relocated numerous marked cemeteries, they exhumed and reburied the graves they could find and identify. That work was real and it was substantial. But they couldn't get everything, and they knew it. Years later, an Army Corps spokesman said as much, almost clinically, that despite every effort to locate unmarked burials, the limited technology of the era made it probable that human remains were left behind, some possibly dating to the antebellum and Civil War periods, some possibly Native American from long before any of this. Unmarked graves, by definition, are the ones you can't find. So some number of the dead, nobody knows how many, were simply left where they lay, and the water came up over them. And it wasn't only graves. When the lake filled, it did not fill over bare, scraped earth everywhere. In places, it filled over structures, road beds, building foundations, wells, parts of an old auto racing track, bridge remnants, the bones of the drowned communities left standing in the dark. There's a diver, a man who spent years working the bottom of Lanier, who described what it's like down there, and it stayed with me. He said things don't decompose the way you'd expect in that cold, still low-oxygen water, that structures and trees are still standing, that everything is just there, preserved. A drowned landscape you can swim through if you're brave enough and the visibility allows, which it usually doesn't, because the water is dark and full of silt and you often can't see your own hand. Now put those two facts together, the standing structures and the terrible death toll, and you understand where the cursed lake reputation actually comes from. No ghosts required. Because the deaths are real, and there are a staggering number of them. Depending on how you count and when you start, somewhere between 500 and 700 people have died in Lake Lanier since it filled. More than 200 of those just since the mid-1990s. Some years, 20 people die in that water in a single season. By body count, it is one of the deadliest lakes in the United States, and it's not particularly close. And people want a supernatural explanation, because the number feels supernatural. The stories pile up, boats that catch fire for no reason, strong swimmers who go under and don't come back, bodies recovered in strange condition, the woman in a blue dress that local legend says wanders the shoreline. The lake has become a genuine piece of American folklore, a place teenagers dare each other to swim, a name that carries a shiver. But here's the unhaunted explanation, and I find it more unsettling than the ghost version because it's true. Lanier is a drowned landscape that millions of people treat like a swimming pool. Underneath the recreational surface are trees, foundations, fences, structures, submerged roads, a whole snagging, grabbing, disorienting world. The water is deep, cold, and dark. Drop 20 feet and you can hit a thermocline where the temperature falls off a cliff, which can shock a swimmer's body. Visibility is often near zero. A person who goes under doesn't sink into empty water. They sink into a forest and a town. And the lake draws enormous crowds of casual boaters and swimmers, many of whom have no idea any of that is below them. You don't need a curse. You need a reservoir built over standing structures, filled with cold, dark water, and handed to 10 million visitors a year who think it's a lake like any other. That combination will kill hundreds of people all by itself. The haunting is just the story we tell because the infrastructure of erasure is physically still down there, and it catches people, is harder to put on a postcard. And then there's the name. They called it Lake Lanier, after a 19th century Georgia poet named Sidney Lanier, who wrote a well-known poem called Song of the Chattahoochee, an ode to the very river they'd just dammed. On its face, a tasteful literary tribute. Sidney Lanier also served in the Confederate Army. So the lake that sits on top of Oscarville, on top of the drowned remnant of a black community that was terrorized off its land, on top of the unmarked graves the Corps couldn't find, is named in honor of a poet who fought for the Confederacy. Nobody, as far as I can tell, did that as a deliberate insult. It was just the obvious, natural, unexamined choice for a lake on the Chattahoochee in 1950s Georgia. Of course you'd name it after the poet of the river. Of course he'd be a Confederate. Most memorialized white Georgians of that era were. That's the thing about this whole story. Almost none of it required anyone to be a cartoon villain at the end. The mob in 1912, they were villains, full stop. But everyone after? The engineers, the officials, the family that named the lake, the 10 million tourists? They were just doing the normal thing, the unexamined thing, the thing that felt like progress. And the normal, unexamined, progressive thing was to pave a paradise directly over a crime and call it after a Confederate and never mention any of it again. Erasure doesn't usually announce itself. Mostly, it just looks like a nice day at the lake. So let me come back to where we started. What does it mean to build a paradise on stolen ground? Stolen not by the builders, but inherited from a mob 40 years back. Who owns the guilt when the crime and the concrete are separated by 4 decades? Here's the best answer I've got. The guilt for 1912 belongs to 1912, to the mob, to the night riders, to a county that chose to stay emptied for 75 years. You can't pin the lynching on the Army Corps of Engineers, and pretending you can, the way the viral myth does, actually lets the real culprits fade into a vaguer, more comfortable story about the government. But the forgetting, that belongs to us. To every decade that took the water and asked no questions about the ground. The crime was committed once, in 1912. The erasure has been committed continuously, every summer since, by everyone who enjoys that lake without ever being told what's under it. And that erasure is the part that's still fixable, because you fix it just by refusing to let it stay forgotten. By saying the name Oscarville. By saying 1100 down to 30. By saying that the most popular lake in Georgia is beautiful, and that beauty is real, and that it sits on top of something that should never have happened. Both things are true at once. That's the hardest discipline in this whole story, holding the beauty and the crime in the same hand and refusing to drop either one. Lanier is a genuinely gorgeous place where families make real, happy memories. And it is a tombstone over a stolen community with a Confederate's name carved on it. You don't have to choose. You're not allowed to choose. You have to hold both, because both are the truth, and the moment you drop one of them, the erasure wins again. The people driven out of Oscarville in 1912 were never made whole. Their descendants are still out there. The Atlanta History Center has spent years now tracking them down, recording their families' stories, putting names back to the number. That work is the opposite of a lake. A lake covers. That work uncovers. And in the end, it's the only thing that answers the question at all. What do we owe the people at the bottom? We owe them their names, spoken out loud above the water, where 10 million people might finally hear them. If this is the kind of story that stays with you, the places America put underwater, and the histories we let the water hide, then tell me where we go next. There's the Quabbin Reservoir in Massachusetts, where 4 whole towns were legally voted out of existence to slake a distant city's thirst. There's Coahuila and the Tallapoosa communities in Alabama, black settlements flooded by southern dams whose stories are only now being recovered. And there's Seneca Village, not drowned, but paved, a thriving black community in Manhattan, erased to build Central Park, the same pattern with grass on top instead of water. Same sentence under all of them. Somebody was here first, and we built our paradise where they used to live. Which name do you want spoken next?